Live. Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Live Edition, where we will discuss last week's articles that I wrote and published for Founder of the Day. Of course, as soon as I do that, my cat opens the door and makes a loud squeaky sound. Now, I'm just a few seconds delayed, I think, for you guys, but please, when you sign in, if you want to join, feel free to comment. I'll try and respond as we go. I am going to attempt to speak slower than usual this week. When I shoot my videos, I try and get it out and talk as fast as I can. But I'm going to speak as loudly and clearly as I usually do, not quietly. Slowly and quietly are different things. As we get into it, people are starting to trickle in. Hi everyone, welcome. While we get warmed up, I do want to say, unfortunately, I should be in Boston right now at Boston History Camp, but because the world seems to have lost its mind, I am not. I am home, which is great, because we can do this video and we can have a good time. On that note, I hope everyone's doing okay. Fortunately, my family's in a situation where we can work remotely for the next 2 weeks or so I will be here. Shooting more videos, I suppose. On that note, as I see myself in the corner, I do, if you like Founder of the Day and you want to support me, I have a bunch of really cool Founders t-shirts and other merch on my website. There's a link in the description below. Based on quotes that I prefer, this one for example, you will permit me to wear my spectacles, by George Washington, which seems a little crazy, but I have a video through the link that you can watch where I tell the story of George Washington and how him putting on his glasses is one of the most important moments in American history, believe it or not. So check that out if you like it. Also, please consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll notice it says Streamlabs above my head. That's the company that I use to shoot these live videos through, as opposed to the other videos I just shoot on my phone and can edit on my computer. It's going to cost me like $300 to get rid of, which I am going to do in the next few weeks, but, and as I say that it but $1 into the Founder of the Day website to pay off my hosting for the year. So if you wanted to contribute and help me out with this so I can, help grow this channel and spread the awareness of obscure American revolutionaries, please either buy a t-shirt or some merch or consider checking out my Patreon page. I have a link to that down below. And if there's anything you'd like to see from Patreon that I don't have on there, something you think would be worth, a few bucks a month, please let me know. I'm really open-minded about it. On that note, we can get started, because I don't want to waste anyone's time. So, in the last week, I'll remind you, I do have, I started only writing on publishing new articles Monday through Friday. So last weekend, I put out 2 old ones through all my social media chains. One of them, the first was on Edmund Pendleton, who's a really fascinating character. About 15 years before the American Revolution, Edmund Pendleton was already a leader in Virginia, and he had already made a name for himself and was in the Colonial Assembly, which was known as the House of Burgesses. And they were there getting things done, and he had a mentor whose name was John Robinson. So John Robinson was both the treasurer of the state of Virginia, and he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And in this situation, there was a little bit of a financial crisis in Virginia. So what happened was the Virginians decided to print some currency. But this was a temporary solution. And the currency was supposed to come back in and be destroyed. And John Robinson, a leader of Virginia, was supposed to be destroying it as it came back in. Instead, he started loaning it out to people and using it as a back for his personal loans, which, yes, is super shady. Unfortunately, all of a sudden he passed away, and Edmund Pendleton was the one who was set to execute his will, and upon doing so, he realized, oh no, Virginia's bankrupt. And it turns out that almost every wealthy Virginian had been taking out loans during this economic crisis from this John Robinson. So all of a sudden, Virginia essentially went bankrupt. all of this money that it thought it had, it didn't actually have. And Pendleton was responsible for paying off Robinson's estate. Now, he was about 45 at this time. He would pass away, excuse me, 4 decades later in his 80s, still trying to pay off this estate. But in the meantime, Edmund Pendleton became one of the most important founders for Virginia. He went to the first and part of the Second Continental Congress. He was the chairman of Virginia's Committee of Correspondence and Committee of Safety, which essentially made him governor of Virginia in all but name during the confusing transition from the royal governor to a revolutionary government. He would sit on the Virginians' early Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, but what we would consider the Supreme Court. So Edmund Pendleton became just an extraordinarily important person in Virginia. Outside of Virginia, he wasn't quite as well known. You know, he did attend some of the Continental Congress, but not extraordinarily well known. Either way, what's really interesting about the fallout from this financial crisis that Pendleton was in charge of resolving is all of a sudden, during this crisis, Great Britain said, we're going to start taxing you more. And the Virginians were like, what? We can't do that. We just helped pay for this war. And now, you know, coming out of the French and Indian War, there was a bit of a recession because when you're no longer at war, war is profitable and always has been. So that hurt. And then there was this Robinson scandal where suddenly the money had no value. And now we're going to raise your taxes. And it was a humongous impetus towards Virginians, at least, driving towards revolution. And again, Virginia was the most populous state. So Virginia's ascension into the revolutionary fervor was extremely important. And because of his place executing the estate of John Robinson, Edmund Pendleton found himself right in the heart of the whole thing. And the Pendleton family has several revolutionaries in it who, you know, we'll talk about eventually. Notably, Nathaniel Pendleton, it was a cousin, I believe, maybe a nephew. He was a fairly distant relative, but he's the one who was Hamilton's second in the duel with Aaron Burr. So the Pendleton family finds themselves all over the colonies for various reasons. So on Sunday, I put out another article I'd written a year or two ago about another person named Edmund, because I like the name and I wanted to go for it. And this man was Edmund Randolph. And Randolph is another extraordinarily important revolutionary family. Edmund Randolph he was a younger man who fought in the war briefly, but he becomes a little more popular. He rises through the ranks of Virginia society and becomes governor of Virginia. He also is sent to the Continental Congress. I'm sorry, let me say this again. Edmund Randolph becomes governor of Virginia and he's sent to the Constitutional Convention. And at the Constitutional Convention, Edmund Randolph presents the Randolph Plan. Now, this plan was written by James Madison, but it was more important that someone of note, like Edmund Randolph, as opposed to little old James Madison, who not a lot of people really knew very well at the convention. It wasn't that he was an unknown. He had already been in the Continental Congress, but Edmund Randolph, as I said, was on his way to be governor of the biggest state in the young country. And Randolph's plan, as it was called throughout the rest of the convention, was basically the big state plan, essentially. Because in response to Edmund Randolph's plan is the New Jersey plan came out, which was what the small size states wanted. And what's interesting is Randolph presented this on like the second or third day of the Constitutional Convention, and no one was ready for it. Virginia knew it was coming, and Pennsylvania knew it was coming, and no one else knew it was coming. Several months go by, and they sit down to sign the Constitution, and Edmund Randolph refuses to sign the Constitution, which is based off the plan that he presented. Now, he has several reasons for this. Mostly, he was afraid that it was assuming too much power from the small states. He did want a larger federal government that could get things done, but he was kind of terrified about after a while, he realized, oh wait, I'm governor of Virginia. It's going to take away my power, and I don't want that. Now he goes home, and as governor, he is to sit as chairman of Virginia's ratification convention. And again, with Virginia being possibly the most important state, well, kind of needed Virginia to go through. And what's interesting is it seems that Randolph does change his mind and start supporting the Constitution during this time, because he as chairman, he kind of sits out of it. You know, people at the time, politicians, took their roles really seriously, and he knew, much like he had just seen George Washington sit objectively as chairman of the Constitutional Convention, and everyone knew who Washington was. Of course, he was going to try and be as objective as possible. So, after the Constitution passes, Edmund Randolph decides to support it. And that's a good idea, because George Washington asks him to sit as the first Attorney General of the United States. And he does. So Edmund Randolph becomes the first Attorney General of the United States. And as a member of Washington's first cabinet, he gets to sit in on some of these meetings that, you know, famously, you have Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson kind of going at each other for various reasons. During these, again, famous debates, Henry Knox is sitting there watching, and Edmund Randolph is in there watching. It turns out Edmund Randolph had made some friends overseas, and he had a letter intercepted on his way to France that was basically saying, yeah, Washington's cabinet's a little out of control. Hamilton and Jefferson are really going at each other. And this intercepted letter is made public and gets to Washington, and Washington is like, Edmund, what exactly is this? And I'll remind you, Edmund Randolph is not yet 40 years old at this point. He's already been governor. He's already gone to the Constitutional Convention. And he's already Attorney General in Washington's cabinet. But he's still under 40 years old. He's about my age. And I can only imagine having George Washington wave his finger at you. And essentially, he was forced to resign, which he did, and he goes back to private life. He remains a leading Virginian for the rest of his life, but this is the end of his federal career. So that is Edmund Randolph. Again, I see a few people are watching. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in there, comments. I am happy to respond. After that, we will go... Oh, did I change my light? YouTube has a dark screen, and I'm popping onto my own website, which is white, because I find white more appealing than black. Just me. So Monday I published an article about a gentleman named John Wesley. So John Wesley is in no way an American founder. Sorry I'm talking about him, but he has this very peculiarly essential role in the development of religion in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. So a quick background. John Wesley is, from my understanding, I am not a religious student much at all, not a religious history student, I should say. But, you know, I read a lot about this because I wanted to get it as right as I can. And it seems that John Wesley is basically the founder of Methodism. And he was older than most of the founders we discussed. He was about Ben Franklin's age. And he lived most of his life in England. Now, he was a very pious man, and his life on its own, and we're not going to get too into his whole life because he had an enormous effect on religion in the 18th century in England. Enormous effect. But Wesley basically, he came to America at one point when he was a younger man. He went to Georgia in the 1730s, right after it was founded. And he thought he was going to be a missionary for Native Americans. And he quickly realized that, you know, when Georgia was founded, they needed a preacher there too. And John Wesley ends up basically being their preacher for about 2 years. Unfortunately, he falls in love with a young woman. But he's struggling with the idea of celibacy. He wants to remain celibate, but also loves this woman, but she doesn't wait for him. She gets married to some other guy. And not long after that, he refuses to give her communion on a technicality. I'm not sure I don't recall exactly what the technicality was, but he basically says, no, you married someone else, even though I said I didn't want to get married. no more being, in God's favor for you. And that didn't end well. He was essentially run out of Georgia and went back to England, never to return. 40 years later, the American Revolution breaks out, and about 10 years after that, it ends. And at the end of the American Revolution, there was, going into the American Revolution, most colonists were members of the Church of England. After we threw off England as our government, we couldn't really be a part of the Church of England anymore. So there was this weird void, because it's not like everyone just stopped believing in God because we had a revolution. No, they believed in the same God and generally had the same faith and same beliefs. They just didn't want to be English anymore. And in this whole, the Methodism had been rising throughout the 18th century, because the First Great Awakening had happened just before the American Revolution, and the Second Great Awakening would happen just at the end of it. I mean, the Second Great Awakening pretty much starts during the Jefferson and Madison years as president. So Wesley's over in England, and Americans start contacting England, and Methodism, which was on the rise, the Methodists, they were like, what do we do? And even though it was unpopular, John Wesley was John Wesley was the point man for Methodism the whole time. So all the religious figures who were contacting England and saying, what do we do? They weren't just contacting England. They were all contacting John Wesley. And he found himself in this situation, and he said, okay, it's controversial, but I'm going to appoint a bishop for the United States. He sent a bishop over, and he said this bishop is going to appoint other bishops and start essentially the Church of the United States. Were there any organized religions in America at the time? Was the Methodist Church one of the first to organize in the U.S.? Great question, and we're going to get there with our next founder. Thanks, John, Ned. Thank you so much. Perfect timing, because so Wesley sends over the ministers, and that's basically his effect on the American Revolution. Truthfully, I've probably spent more time on Wesley than I should have, even though he has an entire life story in England that deserves hundreds of videos, probably. Now, Ned just asked if there was organized religion at the time. Kind of. Hey, Ned. Our next founder is a man named Francis Asbury. Asbury has an extraordinarily interesting story as well, and he is one of the people that organizes Methodism in America officially. Because during the Great Awakening, as I had just discussed, during the Great Awakening, as we just discussed, there were itinerant preachers. So gentlemen would generally come over from England and travel around by horseback or carriage or on foot and preach in an open field. And that's how Methodism really grew in America. Francis Asbury came over as one of these itinerant preachers just before the American Revolution breaks out. And then the American Revolution breaks out. And he finds himself in a peculiar situation. As a man of God, Asbury really didn't want to get involved in the war. He just wanted to, preach the good word. Unfortunately, that wasn't really an option. So when Asbury declared he wasn't taking a side, he was living in Maryland at the time, although, as I said, he was traveling around. Most of his travels at the time were in the Maryland, Pennsylvania, Upper Virginia, and Delaware region. He was living in Maryland, and essentially Maryland was one of the few states that required a loyalty oath. And he said, no, I can't take an oath to you, like I'm staying out of it. And Maryland was like, then you're probably going to be arrested. So he actually fled to Delaware, and he would come and preach underground in Maryland, which some of his constituents liked, or I should say parishioners, I suppose. Some of his followers liked, and others didn't, because it put them in a strange situation to be meeting covertly with a preacher who had not taken the loyalty oath. And he kind of goes about this for several years. As the American Revolution winds down, Asbury starts traveling wider, and a side note, Asbury ends up traveling all over the United States, tens of thousands of miles, including the frontier, and he kept a very detailed diary where we historians have learned a tremendous amount about individual towns along the frontier because of Asbury's diary. But what makes Asbury especially important is a thing called the Christmas Conference. So, as I said earlier with John Wesley, there was this gaping hole where the Church of England left in America. So, when John Wesley appoints a new bishop, he sends him over to the United States to also appoint Francis Asbury as the second bishop in the United States. And when he gets there, Asbury says, no. Well, Asbury says, maybe, but he was aware of the democratic nature of the spirit of the people of the United States at the time. Yes, it was a republic, and they didn't like mob rule, but the people were supposed to vote. So what they actually did is they called a conference, and they had all of the itinerant preachers in America were invited. It was about 80 people were invited, if I'm not mistaken, and 61 of them showed up to this conference in Baltimore. And it was right around Christmas time. And they said, listen, let's vote to approve Asbury. Asbury basically said, if you want me to be the bishop, we're going to vote, and you can approve me. And they did. And on 3 consecutive days, they had 3 consecutive votes. And forgive me, I'm not a Methodist, and I don't know all the proper terminology for the levels, but he was a preacher, and they voted him a level up one day and had a party. The next day, voted him up a level, had a party, and the next day voted him up to bishop. And additionally, not only does this make him the first bishop elected, but they also sorted out rules as for how to organize Methodism, as you asked, Ned, in the United States. And furthermore, there were actually, this is the first time 2 African-American men whose names escape me, I apologize, I've read like 60 of them when I was researching this article. There was the first time a black person was made a preacher in the United States, was at this conference. And from there, Methodism blossomed, and really was the first, I don't want to call it the first American religion, especially because Native Americans had dozens of religions, and also because it's, I don't want to say something offensive, but it's a form of Christianity, and Christianity certainly doesn't come from the United States. I guess I shouldn't say that either. I understand Mormonism has the belief of that. I don't want to make assumptions about any religion. I have my own beliefs, and that's fine. But that, in essence, is the story of Francis Asbury and the creation of the organized religion in the United States. And I should also note, there were several other instances of organized religions. For example, Ned, you asked about, to answer your question further, I know Connecticut had a state religion well into James Madison's presidency. I don't want to get too off topic. I should do a video on Pierpont Edwards and his Toleration Party, because although the United States Constitution forbids a state religion in the United States, it does not forbid an individual state from having a state religion, which at the time many states, especially in New England, did. And there was a divide between, I think it was Protestantism and Anglicanism, if I'm not mistaken. And I will make a separate video on that. I'll do that this week. That'll be fun. But yeah, there were already, again, as far as organized religion goes, there was the Church of England, and on top of that, there were Anglicans and Presbyterians, I believe, were fairly well organized. Again, I haven't put that much study into religion itself. I'm always used to focus on politics. Since I started Founder of the Day, I've really tried to learn more about military history, which I was always passingly interested in. As far as religion, I haven't put enough time in to speak with too much authority, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. But please keep the questions coming. I will do more research on it. I'll be happy to talk about it further next week. But let's move on before our video runs too long and I bore you. Jonathan Ward. I don't know if TJ's watching. There are so many different religions. Yes, Ned. So many religions, and they're all very nice. Now, I don't know if TJ is watching today, but we do have a viewer named TJ who requested I do a video on Jonathan Ward way too long ago, and it took me way too long. I wrote the article finally on Jonathan Ward. Ward was from Massachusetts and led a militia, and Battle of Lexington Concord happened, and the militia came out, and he led some men to Lexington and Concord. He didn't actually make it to Lexington and Concord. He went pretty much straight to the siege of Boston, but he earned respect, and he seems to have been distantly related to Artemus Ward, who, as I've spoken about before, was really the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, because after Lexington and Concord, all these militias came together, and someone had to take charge, and he did, and Artemus Ward basically ran the Continental Army until the Continental Congress named it the Continental Army and sent George Washington to take over, at which point Artemus Ward graciously handed it over to Washington and became the number 2 general in the United States Continental Army. He seems to have been distantly related to Ward. I couldn't find any direct connection, but the Ward family was a larger one in the greater Boston region at the time. I note this because Artemus Ward had a regiment of soldiers. And then the Continental Army decided that major generals couldn't have their own regiment, because how could you run your own regiment and also instruct colonels to run their regiment? No, you can't be on the same level as your inferior. You've got to be above them. It seems to be tactically important. I've never been a military man either, but I understand that you need dedicated leaders. So Artemus Ward needed to find a replacement for his own position, basically. And it was between 2 people, Jonathan Ward, the hero of this conversation, and a man named Henshaw, Joseph Henshaw. Now, these 2 people both wanted the position. And strangely, instead of Ward just choosing, the decision actually went to the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly, the Massachusetts Revolutionary Government. Got to decide who took this position. Now, I researched and could not figure out why the decision was taken away from either Artemus Ward or George Washington and sent to the Massachusetts government. I have to presume that since this was part of the Massachusetts line and the entire regiment was Massachusetts men, that they wanted the decision of which Massachusetts officer got to lead Massachusetts men to be made by Massachusetts. And even though Artemus Ward was also from Massachusetts, it seems that, again, I would assume that any decision made by the number 2 general in the Army was really being made by the number 1 general in the Army. So, fascinatingly, they actually chose Jonathan Ward over Joseph Henshaw. And what's really great about this is that Artemus Ward, have I ever done a video on Nathaniel Greene? Charles King. King Charles I. Okay. Just to finish up on Jonathan Ward. Artemus Ward was Ward's regiment. And then Jonathan Ward took over Ward's regiment. So technically the name changed and stayed exactly the same. So, I know that's a little bit, I thought that was fascinating. Let's see. I'm still getting used to live streaming. You guys keep commenting and then they disappear while I'm talking. I'm stuttering. Okay, a few questions. Have I ever done a video on Nathaniel Greene? I think I have, but when I did, it would have been one of the earlier ones. And my first few YouTube videos are kind of garbage. Trying to make them better every time. King Charles the First, I will look into that. I will contact you and send you over if I have. Although, actually, please subscribe, because I wrote a few months back about Nathaniel Greene's bankruptcy after his victory in the South, essentially. Nathaniel Greene is one of the most important generals. So, I'll put out a video this week discussing a brief overview of his life, and then and go a little bit into depth in depth. Hold on. I'll go a little bit in depth on the debt that occurred in the aftermath because he sacrificed so much to the revolution. So I'll make a Nathaniel Greene video this week if you subscribe. Is that a deal? Can we do that? And then, were people usually appointed as commanders of military units based on ability, or was it more or less based on your social status? Okay, that's a great question. So from my experience, so I've been writing articles every day on American founders for just over 2 years. Celebrated 2-year anniversary 10 days ago. I have found that most of it seems to have been based on status. However, there are certainly a number of officers who made their way up because of what they did. I'm racking my brains off the top of my mind. Like, for example, Henry Knox. Henry Knox was not... He was an artisan. He was a bookseller. He was middle of the road, so to speak. He was essentially what Paul Revere was. Silversmith, bookseller. They weren't poor. They weren't bottom of society, but they certainly weren't upper crust. But Knox, through determination and intelligence, he was never in very good shape. He's a bigger fellow. But Knox, using his intelligence, what he had read and what he had studied and what he had discussed with both British officers and eventually colonial officers, he learned a lot about artillery. And then he had the famous artillery train where he took the cannons from Ticonderoga down to Boston to help with the siege of Boston and fortify Dorchester Heights. So Henry Knox is a great example of someone who really wasn't that high in social status and rose up. Furthermore, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was, I believe, forgive my language, but I believe I'm quoting John Adams in saying that Alexander Hamilton was the bastard son of a Scotch peddler. That might not be word for word the quote, but he definitely called him the bastard son. So there are a lot of cases of people who rose above their station, so to speak, as they like to sing about in the Broadway play Hamilton, which, if you haven't listened to it, I can't recommend enough. Even if Broadway's not your thing and hip-hop's not your thing, I cannot recommend enough, if you're taking the time to watch this video, you listening to the soundtrack to Hamilton. But, again, in the end, it really was essentially your social status that got you to a rank like general or this or that. Because Hamilton never rose to the rank of general. I think he peaked at, was it colonel or major? I'm not sure what his exact title was, but essentially when he was working for George Washington was his top. Oh, my pleasure, Ned. Thank you for asking. I really, I hope that I can continue stopping this conversation to talk about this. I really enjoy the questions and learning what you want to know and learning what I know. Let's see. Oh, we're at 33 minutes. Okay. We're going to have our longest video today. Moving on from Jonathan Ward. Well, I'm sorry, TJ. I got a little lost on Ward there, but the links to these articles are down below. So if I skip over something or it feels like I leave something out, and please feel free to go down and read the article or email me or contact me on Facebook or Twitter. Instagram, I'm still getting the hang of. Can't really figure out what to do. I've been posting pictures of pretending to have the founders talk to you, but I don't know if I'm going to keep doing that. So the last biography that I wrote this week was on a man named John Porter. And I just kind of stumbled on a John Porter during my research. He was a, excuse me, should have brought a water. Little parts. So he was an officer in the, cat, get out here. He was the, oh, sorry, I got a cat tearing up my carpet. Since they know I'm occupied. Now it's time to destroy the house. He was a major, yes. He was a major in the Massachusetts line. I actually ran into John Porter when I was studying Jonathan Ward. Porter worked as the paymaster for Jonathan Ward, which is where I got sidetracked during my research and went on this little tangent. And Porter has a fascinating interaction with George Washington. So John Porter serves as paymaster, and he makes his way up to major, and he jumps around to this regiment, that regiment, through the Continental Army. But he serves from the Battle of Lexington and Concord through Yorktown. The entire actual fighting of the war, John Porter serves. 7 years. At war. All the time. And then he's given leave, which, some people were given. Now, when he went on leave, he was expected to return. What John Porter did is he got on a ship with his friend, the Marquis de Lafayette, and he sailed for France. Well, he sailed for Europe, I should say. So, kind of left. He did meet with, he went to Amsterdam, and he met with John Adams, where he gave a letter. He actually, essentially, is the one who told John Adams about Yorktown. Hey, we won. Guess what? All these years you've been over here in Europe, we won. John Adams, of course, responds with his usual unhappiness and says, well, I'm not so sure this is it. We shouldn't count them out yet. Like, everyone else is pumped we won. And John Adams is like, I don't know if we beat them yet. Typical John. So anyway, John Porter goes back to the United States the following October. And he had been missing for a year. And the Continental Army was not very happy for him to have overstayed his leave. So he gets court-martialed. And he actually gets removed from the Continental Army. And this is in October of 1782. This is a year after Yorktown. We're just waiting for the information to come back. And clearly Porter wasn't a nobody. He sailed with Marquis de Lafayette. He went straight to John Adams. He was running in certain circles that should not be discounted. Even for, speaking of status in society and your position, he was only a major, which is nothing to snuff at. He was an officer, but considering the circles he ran in, you would think he would have been, well, we'll say a little higher on the list, but I'm not here to disparage him. So a few years go by, and Porter returns to private life. He acts as a merchant, which is one of the reasons he went to Europe, is because he had been ignoring his merchant business for years. So he goes over to Europe, works as a merchant during the 1780s, getting things back in order, and comes back to the United States. And this is when the Continental Congress, technically the Congress of the Confederation, as we like to call it after the Articles of Confederation were passed, but he goes back. And he essentially is, the Congress starts handing out pensions for the revolution, for soldiers. And he wants one. His argument is, I served for 7 years. I should get a pension too. And Congress was like, I don't know. And then he writes to George Washington. And he says, I know it's been a long time. It's been 1782 has been like 5 or 6 years, but I really appreciate it if you could write to the Congress on my behalf. Like, I know I got kicked out because I left and didn't tell anyone, but like, I did go tell John Adams that the war was over, and John Adams was the one who nominated you to be commander-in-chief in the first place. He doesn't say it exactly like that. He's not threatening in any way. He's if you read the letter, he's very gracious and, please, sir, if you have the kindness in your heart. And Washington basically writes back, listen, I can't dig through my records for you, or I'm going to have to dig through my records for hundreds of people, and I'm retired. Which, side note, is hilarious because he's about to be president of the United States for 8 years. But I'm retired, and I don't want to do this. I'm sitting under my fruit trees. I can't look up things for every person. But, thinking off the top of my head, you had bailed on us and gone overseas. And yeah, we had won at Yorktown, but like John Adams was saying, we weren't really sure the war was over. So, he leaves. He waits. I see your question, and I'll get to it. So Porter waits for Washington's response. Washington basically says, "Can't help you." He's like, "Sorry, based on my recollection, no. Like, you bailed on us, and we needed you, and I'm not going to pretend that you didn't break military rules." and those were the rules, and I had to stick by them. So although I didn't see any indication that he received a pension then, I did see later on his daughter seems to have been looking for his pension. Again, Porter was a merchant, so it doesn't seem like he was really one of the foot soldiers who needed that kind of assistance. Now, let me get back to Ned's question real quick. How much does my color change? Oh, yeah, I get really dark when I go to the YouTube channel. Okay. Sorry, keep it in mind. Was his leave open-ended, or did his superiors make it clear that he expected his return? Did officers have a different set of rules from enlisted men in that regard? Great questions. Officers didn't have different sets of rules. To answer the second part first, they didn't technically have sets of rules, but they were definitely treated more leniently. And as for the first question, I stumbled onto this article through a letter from what's his name? William Heath, General William Heath, who was a major general in the Continental Army. Although most of Heath's time was spent in the highlands of the Hudson Valley region, making sure the British didn't go up the Hudson Valley to split the rebellious colonies in half. William Heath was important, but his name doesn't come up as much as many of the other major generals, even the ones below him on the chain. He was relatively high up on the chain. Heath's an interesting character. I should also make a video soon about him. But Heath was, excuse me, I stumbled onto the letter where General Heath writes to George Washington, hey, John Porter went to Europe. They say something along the lines of, he's gone beyond the sea. Did you know he was going beyond the sea? And is there any way we can confirm he went beyond the sea? So actually, I followed the trail, and Washington gets this letter, and then writes to Robert Hanson Harrison, who was one of his secretaries throughout the war. Another fascinating character. And Washington says, hey, you're my secretary, can you answer this question? Did we give him permission? And Robert Hanson Harrison writes back, nah. And then Washington writes back to William Heath, who says no. And then they basically wait. That's in January of 1782. And then they wait till the following October when he gets home to court-martial him, because they can't court-martial him from afar. I guess they could have done it in absentia, but that wouldn't make a lot of sense. To answer your question, was it made clear when he was suspected to return? I didn't see any letters that documented that. I don't know if they said that to his face, because I wasn't there, but it certainly seems like I am 100% certain that his direct superior, Major General William Heath, did not expect him to be leaving permanently, and I was under the impression that word got back to Heath he had left for Europe when Heath was expecting not word to come back, but for the man to return. So I can't say without a doubt whether it was made entirely clear when he should return, but then as now, you were generally given leave for this amount of time. Okay, be returned in 4 weeks. There was very rarely where they were like, I'm just going to go. I don't know when I'll be back. There are occasions I've run across where things like that happen, like John Potter in Pennsylvania, who was the chief, the highest ranking general in the Pennsylvania militia. He had a sick spouse, so he went to take care of her, and that was kind of open-ended, but they expected him back, and he was back in a few months. That's almost always how it happened. It was usually like, not necessarily, I'm going for a month. It was, I'm going to take care of this business. Or, I'm hurt or sick, I'm going to heal, and I'll return when I heal. So, you don't often see exact dates or anything of that nature, but there is a certain accomplishment expected before you return. It wasn't leave forever. It definitely wasn't go to Europe. Was not on the list. Let's see, we got some more questions. King Charles #1 also. Have I done Francis Marion? The Swamp Fox? I don't think so. there are a lot of founders. The reason I started Founder of the Day, the website, and now the YouTube channel is because there are so many founders. Like, I'm talking about John Porter right now. He's a nobody. Like, but he played this really interesting role that speaks a lot to military justice at the time and how the pensions worked. Francis Marion is certainly a much more popular leader, especially with the nickname like the Swamp Fox. And no, I haven't done a video about him. I gotta write these down. I'm trying to keep notes. I believe someone said something about Commodore Preble. Was that you last week, Ned, or did I run into him? Oh, I believe someone told me about Preble. Anyway, okay, writing them down. Marion. Was it Lincoln before? No, it was Green before, right? Yeah. I'll do that. I don't want to bore you with me writing things down. And then, so no, I don't think I've done a video on Francis Marion. I will do a video on Francis Marion. He's a lot of fun. Ned, I wonder if Heath and Porter had some sort of dysfunctional relationship. So that's interesting. The thing is, so Heath was a major general, and Porter was a major. So there were definitely some, I don't want to call them middlemen, but other officers in between. Now, I don't know, I use a lot of my research. I wouldn't be possible to do this if it weren't for Founders Online, which is offered on the National Archives website. It's the best thing the government has ever done, other than win the Revolutionary War. And maybe write the Constitution. But, I mean, if you were an anti-federalist, that's not necessarily true. Founders Online, if you're not aware, is 180,000 documents from the American Revolution. Correspondence, letters, publications, journals that have been typed out, and you can basically Google through it and search the American Revolution. Now, I bring this up because, when I was looking up an obscure person like John Porter, I look up the letters and see what they write to each other. I didn't see any actual communication between Heath and Porter. And I mentioned that there would be other people in the middle, because what's probably happened is it wasn't that Heath looked around and said, "Where's Porter?" It was probably that Porter's superior went to his superior, William Heath, and said, "This guy's missing." I would have to imagine that's how it went. They would have, however, met at the court-martial, because apparently Washington attended the court-martial also. That's why Porter wrote to Washington directly years later, asking if he remembered, because Washington did remember. So, it's hard to say that's a dysfunctional relationship. If you go to trial and you meet the judge, is that a dysfunctional relationship? Kind of. Yeah. If there's any more questions, send them in. Before we go, the last paper I wrote was on Federalist number 72. I just published this yesterday. So, why Alexander Hamilton thought the president should be able to be elected for unlimited terms. Now, last week I talked about how Hamilton defended 4-year terms for the presidency. He thought it was the baby bear's porridge. Not too long, not too short, just right. But in the next paper, 72, he says that the president should be able to run as many times as he wants, and he should be able to hold that position indefinitely. Now, people like to talk about this, but Alexander Hamilton stood up at the Constitutional Convention and recommended that when they write the Constitution, they include a king, a monarch. Something King Charles you might appreciate. Now, he was quickly booed off the floor, and I don't mean actually booed, but the silence that struck the room, he sat down and didn't mention it again. And he seems to, writing the Federalist Papers, 6 months later, he seems to have backed away from that principle after seeing the reaction of the rest of the leaders of the United States. So, but he does agree to 4-year terms. He thinks that's right. But he does think the presidency, you should be allowed to be elected indefinitely for as many times as you want. And when the Constitution was written, that was an option. Nowadays, after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president for 4 terms, the rest of his life, 12 years, going on 13. After that, in 1951, we passed the 22nd Amendment, which prohibited a president from serving more than 2 terms. But that was not the case in the 1780s when they first wrote the Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton was publicly defending it as a Federalist. So it seems very opposed to what we consider normal today, because it's been 70 years since it's been illegal. It's been only 70 years. And Hamilton thought it was a good idea, and for several reasons. First of all, and I again, when I write my Federalist reviews, I'm trying to make it super plain language, boil it down to just what he means, because these are lengthy papers that use a lot of old-timey language, and they're not fun to read. They're not fun to read. I'll be honest with you. I don't enjoy reading them. I enjoy what I learn when I read them. But, I don't speak old-timey language. And it's one thing to read the letters where people are just communicating, but reading the Federalist where they're trying to be fancy about it, because this is for publication, then they're really going for it. And especially Hamilton. I'm not a huge fan of his writing style. But why should we have a president indefinitely? First and foremost, social upheaval. If we have, every time a new president comes on board, well, guess what? That means he's going to change all his offices. And the whole country's getting a change. You're getting a new government. That's a lot. And that can really lead to instability in society. Now, nowadays we know that's not really true, but we didn't know that then, and it seemed to be true. So, that's his first reason. We should just let the president stay. If the people want the president to stay, we should let him stay, because, it's such a pain to have a new president, essentially. And then he also goes into the president's behavior. If you're a president, and you're in year 3 of 4, and you want to get elected for a 4th or 5th term, you got to keep behaving good, or people aren't going to vote for you. But if you're only get 2 terms, and you're in year 7 of 8, what's the point of behaving well? Why wouldn't you try and rig the system to profit you when you leave? Because you're not coming back. Now, of course, impeachment was an idea then, and don't be mean, don't be a jerk. It's kind of obvious, but with power becomes, what's the quote? Great power corrupts absolutely. Absolutely, I can't apparently talk anymore. This is the longest video I've ever made. But we're almost done. Furthermore, if your presidency is going to end and you like being president, well then that gives an inclination, that gives a reason for you to try and rig the system, to try and take over as dictator, because you don't want to lose this power. You want to hold on to it. Which again, when I heard it, when I was reading this, I was like, that makes so much sense. Like, no, there should be term limits, right? I believe in term limits, but that makes a lot of sense. And then finally, what Hamilton says is the American people want the best president possible. Now, he takes kind of a dismal view of it, where it's like, if this is the person who's president is the best candidate, why not keep him there? How many good presidents could there be in the United States? And even back then, it seems like, no, there were a lot of good candidates. There are millions of us now. There were a handful of million back then. You got to have more than one person, right? Like, it's a pretty dismal view. But his point is, if there is a person that the majority of people want to keep as president, who is the Constitution to tell the people that they can no longer have the person they want to be president as president? Which is I found to be a striking argument. It was a little peculiar, but again, it made more sense than I feel like it should. So that's the last video, the last article I published this week. I did have some questions roll in as I was talking. Chain of command. I'm very grateful for this channel. While I thoroughly enjoy American history, I need to gain more knowledge of founding history. Well, thank you, King Charles. That's very nice of you to say. I really appreciate it. I like getting feedback like that. I should, while I'm at it, give a shout out to Nancy. I'm sorry, Janet. Actually wrote me a letter in the mail that I mentioned, I believe, last week, and I was very slow to respond to her, but she asked me about her family and the Biddles, who I have done some articles on. And you can look at, I'm going to write about another Biddle this week, and then I'll be talking about them 3 o'clock next Saturday. We'll chit-chat about it. If there are any other founders you want to learn about, I wrote down King Charles, Francis Marion, and Nathaniel Green. Hopefully I'll make a video about one of the two of them, or maybe write an article about one of the two of them. I will make a video about Green this week, because I've written more than one article on him, and I know I could pretty quickly talk about some of his more fascinating, again, as I said before, the debt he fell into after the American Revolution, and his relationship with Robert Morris, who, if you don't know, I think like the first video I made was on Robert Morris, so I should probably do a better one now. Basically the financier of the Revolution. If there's anyone else you'd like to learn about, please let me know. I am concluding right now. We're about to hit an hour, which is unbelievable. As I said earlier, I'm trying to talk a little bit slower this week so I don't run through it too fast. But, yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks, Ned. I appreciate it. This is starting to become a lot of fun. And that's what I was hoping when I started it, is more and more people would join on. As I said last week, Ned, TJ didn't show up with us this week, but King Charles, thanks for joining us. Next week we'll have 5 people, and the week after that we'll have 10, and eventually there'll be less talk about the articles I've written and more just conversation, I assume. Or not, I don't know. It's fun to find out, and I really, really appreciate you guys joining me this afternoon and spending an hour of your life with me and talking about the American Revolution. I find it so much fun. I'm just noticing I'm wearing one of the few t-shirts I have with the George Washington quotes. Go to the link below on my website. I have a few merch things with some of my favorite quotes. If you were interested in supporting the site, that's a great way to do it. And if there were different quotes I don't have there that you'd like to see, let me know. I made t-shirts with quotes that I really like. For example, "You will permit me to wear my spectacles" by George Washington. Probably the most important sentence ever said in American history. Yes. Go to my website. There's a link to a video I made about the quote. You'll like it. I'm going to sign off now. Let's see if I can do it right this time. Because I always hit the wrong buttons. And still figuring out how to go live. I think we decided my sign-off was going to be round bottom, which only makes sense if you saw that one video. But round bottom being George Washington's property in the Ohio Valley that he sold off. Okay, kind of ending on a down note, but you guys have a great day, and I will see you round bottom.